10 tahun lalu dia yang minta kita ke jalanan untuk protes GST. Dulu tentang, sekarang bincang. Tak apa, satu kemajuan juga.
Kempen Pakatan Harapan untuk memenangi PRU 14 yang dahulu berdasarkan janji mereka untuk menamatkan GST yang diperkenalkan oleh Kerajaan Barisan Nasional di bawah Najib Razak. Tapi itu cerita dululah. Namun kini Kerajaan Perpaduan yang diketuai oleh Pakatan Harapan mula membincangkan kembali tentang kemunculan GST dan sejajar dengan fokus utama kerajaan untuk mengukuhkan ekonomi negara selaras dengan rancangan Malaysia ke-12 baru-baru ini yang memberi bayangan GST akan dilaksanakan semula dan sekaligus mendapat pelbagai reaksi dari rakyat yang rata-rata menolak pelaksanaan cukai ini. Jadi apa sebenarnya yang berlaku? Pihak kerajaan menyatakan GST adalah langkah untuk merancakkan ekonomi negara yang sangat stabil manakala rakyat masih takut dengan cukai dan ini menimbulkan persoalan lah. Adakah GST adalah sesuatu yang memang tidak boleh dielakkan? Dan untuk memahami perkara ini dengan lebih jelas lagi, kami di MKR dapatkan pakar kewangan iaitu Cik Sharmila, iaitu Senior Research Executive under Economics and Business di Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs Ideas. Dan sebelum kita bincang dengan lebih lagi, mungkin Cik Sharmila nak perkenalkan diri sebagai pembuka kata. Silakan.
Hai, nama saya Sharmila. Saya researcher daripada Ideas dalam unit Economic dan Business. Thank you so much for having me to have this discussion.
Sebelum kita tanya Cik Sharmila dengan lebih lagi kan, saya nak ucapkan terima kasih atas kesudian Cik Sharmila untuk bersama-sama dengan Yaya dan tim MKR hari ini. Dan tanpa berlengah masa lagi, ajukan soalan pertama kepada Cik Sharmila. First thing first lah, kenapa perlunya, pentingnya kerajaan untuk mengutip cukai? Kedengarannya soalan ini memang agak simple, agak mudah, tetapi ramai orang muda yang masih keliru dengan dasar percukaian ini. Asas mengutip cukai ni, mungkin Cik Sharmila boleh jelaskan sedikit.
So kerajaan mengutip cukai untuk berbagai sebab. Antaranya, the main reason is untuk sebagai sumber pendapatan utama kerajaan untuk membiayai perbelanjaan pentadbiran negara. So ini termasuk perbelanjaan perkhidmatan awam, sosial seperti kemudahan kesihatan, pendidikan, jalan raya dan juga untuk dari segi pertahanan dan keselamatan negara. Selain itu, cukai juga digunakan sebagai dasar fiskal untuk menstabilkan ekonomi negara dan juga untuk menangani kemelesetan ekonomi. So ini dijalankan melalui potongan cukai ataupun suntikan dana kewangan untuk menggalakkan pertumbuhan ekonomi. Sebaliknya, semasa inflasi, cukai akan ditingkatkan untuk mengurangkan permintaan barangan ataupun demand dalam pasaran untuk mengawal peningkatan harga. Dalam masyarakat kita, there are also vulnerable communities. So within those vulnerable communities, cukai akan digunakan sebagai development expenditure untuk membiayai pentadbiran negara. For example, in terms of kesihatan, sebab we have free healthcare. I mean not free, but then we do have some payment that is subsidized. So for those kind of development expenditure, we do need taxes to pay for those expenditures.
Apakah jenis cukai yang beri pulangan tertinggi dekat Malaysia?
So secara amnya, cukai terdiri daripada cukai langsung dan juga cukai tidak langsung. So direct taxes and also indirect taxes. So untuk Malaysia specifically, tahun lepas kita boleh lihat yang secara jumlahnya hasil cukai yang Malaysia perolehi tahun lepas is 11.7% of our GDP. So that's about 209 billion tahun lepas saja. So daripada hasil cukai ini adalah terdiri daripada cukai langsung dan juga cukai tidak langsung. And cukai langsung is the penyumbang utama for our tax revenue. It's almost 53.6%. So this one, cukai langsung terdiri daripada cukai pendapatan individu dan juga syarikat, which is corporate tax and individual taxes. And then also cukai pendapatan petroleum. So those are the things that are a part of the cukai langsung. So the highest contributor would be the cukai corporate tax, 33.1%. So that's one of the higher contributors, followed by individual taxes, and then also pendapatan petroleum, about like 6.3%. But the most is still corporate taxes at 33%. And then if you look at cukai tidak langsung, we have SST, that's about 11.4%. The highest is still corporate taxes.
Mungkin ramai yang dah lupa apa itu SST sebenarnya kan? Boleh Cik Sharmila terangkan sikit SST?
So for SST, when we introduced GST in 2015, we replaced it again with SST, which was the old system yang kita ada sebelum tu. So SST juga merupakan salah satu consumption tax. So dalam in terms of consumption tax, kita ada GST, value added taxes, SST. So every country will have their own sets of consumption taxes, and for Malaysia is the SST. So SST is more of a, we will say, cukai one-off. where the cukai akan dikenakan kepada barangan pada the sale of the goods. So at the end when you purchase the goods, that's when you will be charged for the SST.
Bagaimana di Malaysia bila dibandingkan dengan negara lain dalam nisbah pengutipan cukai? Maksudnya di sini, adakah cukai pendapatan sekarang setimpal dengan tahap pengutipan cukai di negara-negara lain, khususnya yang sama kedudukan ekonomi dengan Malaysia lah?
Okay, sebelum kita masuk sebelum kita masuk whether the cukai pendapatan itu setimpal ke tidak, if we look dari segi hasil cukai, meaning the government revenue of taxes, Malaysia's government revenue for taxes in 2021 was 11.8%, which is actually lower compared to purata negara-negara lain di Asia dengan Pasifik, which is at 19.8%. And then if you look at negara-negara OECD, purata hasil cukainya 34.1%, and Malaysia is only 11.8% lah. So hasil cukai kita memang lower. Then and also since Malaysia ada sasaran untuk mencapai defisit yang 3 ke 3.5%. So untuk memastikan fiscal sustainability, there is some effort that government needs to do to mengembangkan dan also meneliti the tax base lah, to increase our government revenue so that we can support development expenditures. Tapi dari segi tax rate, so if corporate taxes, we can say that Asia has one of the lowest corporate taxes among the region. So Asia has about 19.5%. Kalau kita compare dengan other Asian countries, it's more or less the same. Malaysia is at 24%. Tapi if you look at Thailand and Vietnam, it's at 20%. Singapore is also around the same. So it's more or less the same, between 19 to 20%. For Asia itself, among other regions, it's the lower ones lah.
Dia tak boleh naik lagi ya? Kira macam tu je rate dia.
Because usually kalau kita naikkan corporate taxes, kita punya competitiveness and the business profits will also reduce, so investments will reduce as well. So we have to take that into consideration as well lah when we are putting in the corporate taxes. But then we have countries like Australia yang ada 30% corporate tax, so there is some countries that higher corporate taxes lah. But it depends on the economic structure of the country.
Menteri Ekonomi Rafizi Ramli ada menyatakan akan memperkenalkan semula GST. Tapi apa sebenarnya asas mudahnya lah untuk orang muda untuk memahami perkara ini dengan lebih mudah dan lebih jelas?
Consumption taxes termasuk juga value added taxes, GST ataupun SST. So most countries they have implemented some form of value added taxes ataupun GST. So for GST itself, it's basically cukai nilai tambah. Meaning the cukai akan dikenakan pada every langkah of the production atau pengeluaran barang. So that means sebagai contoh, cukai akan dikenakan semasa proses pengeluaran on the materials yang digunakan, and then the cukai also akan dikenakan semasa proses distribution, and then finally in the retail. So it's the value bertambah of cukai lah. So that's why you see that there's some form of inflation bila GST diperkenalkan lah. So when they are buying the goods in the market, it already has multiple levels of taxes lah dalam dia punya produk tu.
Lepas ni kalau GST diperkenalkan kembali, berapa persen tu? Adakah 12%? Macam takut je.
Because currently I think because it's a post-COVID environment, inflation is still pretty unstable, and also prices are pretty unstable. Inflation is pretty high. So I think if they were to introduce GST, they would probably introduce it at a much more lower rate as a starting period. Yeah. I think based on what I've heard in the news, I think the proposal is around 2 to 3%. I think.
Okay. Okay. Pada pendapat Cik Sharmila, kenapa GST ditentang hebat oleh Pakatan Harapan? Yang ketika itu Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim pernah menyatakan yang GST yang dibawa oleh Najib Razak ni lebih pada menzalimi rakyat je. Dulu cakap menzalimi, sekarang nak ada balik.
Yeah, actually the GST itself is usually called a regressive tax because it will impact across all income levels. Because GST ni dia akan will be the same for lower income level and also for higher income level. So most of the time it's called a regressive tax because you will have the same impact. So in this case, when GST was introduced in 2015, I think there was a lot of dissatisfaction among people because they assumed that ia akan meningkatkan kos sara hidup and then also akan meningkatkan beban kewangan. So but then there is some advantages to GST. So in order to increase our pendapatan negara, we do need increase our tax base and tax revenue. So GST is one of the way to do it because you get you won't have leakages because dia akan ada tax on every supply chain level. So and also another way is also to increase transparency because we able to reduce pengelakan cukai. So we be able to mengutip lebih banyak cukai lah. So GST has that advantages. Tapi untuk memastikan the manfaat of the GST, policies have to be followed dengan implementasi yang lebih menyeluruh lah, which I think maybe did not happen in the earlier stages in 2015. So there should be a lot more reforms untuk membantu the rakyat in terms of sistem perlindungan sosial, and also memastikan ada subsidi yang lebih tersasar for those who will be impacted by the GST implementation lah.
Tapi Cik Sharmila setuju ke yang GST ni merupakan satu langkah terbaik?
I think at the moment I think there's some hesitation to introduce GST because of the inflation, because definitely with GST inflation will go up at least the medium term kan. So there are some hesitation, but I think the government can also do can also look at other avenues to increase their tax base. So it's not only specifically at GST. And I think if they were to introduce GST, he has to be followed by a lot of steps and also scrutiny, to make sure that when they implement it, it is a good system.
Mengikut kajian, hanya 16.5% rakyat Malaysia yang membayar cukai pendapatan. Jadi adakah GST ini tidak diperlukan sekiranya kita meningkatkan tahap pungutan cukai pendapatan dan menamatkan pelepasan kepada mereka yang berpendapatan rendah?
There is other avenues that the government can look at, which is to reduce the threshold of the income tax, because I think now there is a lot less, like you mentioned, a lot of people are not paying taxes because they are exempted. So I think that should be scrutinized again, and then we can increase the tax base by reducing the threshold. This way we can also gain more tax revenue, but also they can also look at other avenues like subsidy rationalization, which I think the government is trying to do. Through this, I think they can provide better targeted subsidies, and also through this save up more on our revenue. Obviously, we need to protect the community in lower income, so probably would not suggest to reduce the threshold so that even the lower income people will be paying taxes. But then if they were to do that, then they should be providing targeted subsidies to those communities. So if they were to increase the threshold, then they should provide them with subsidies so they can support themselves while they are paying taxes. So these are a combination of things that the government needs to look at, both at the reform of the tax system, but also to support those lower income communities to ensure that while they are reforming the tax system, the lower communities are also not impacted by it.
Pada pendapat Cik Sharmila, adakah negara bakal menghadapi masalah politik daripada pihak pembangkang sekiranya GST ditimbulkan di Parlimen?
In the past, the GST has been used as like a political tool rather than a proper debate on like the usefulness of GST, because I think both sides have said that GST is good and GST is bad on both sides. Yeah, so it hasn't been a very consistent point of view. But if you look at it in reality, almost 90% of countries in the world have some form of GST or value-added tax. Obviously, if like such a huge proportion of countries have been using those systems, there must be some advantages to it. So if you look at it in reality, what's the reason people are against GST? Maybe because there should be more, the government needs to build more trust among people through, I think, good governance and transparency. Because I think while the country wants to impose GST, there should be more transparency in their fiscal expenditure. So the people would trust that the money that they're paying for the taxes are being used for good programs or subsidies. So they will be able to welcome the implementation of GST. I think recently there also has been a lot more move to ensure that the subsidies that we are providing are more data driven, so that the government uses more data to ensure that the subsidies are targeted. So through this, with the implementation of GST, the people who are impacted will be able to overcome the income difficulties through these subsidies and assistance that are provided by the government.
Ramailah yang mungkin tertanya-tanya, dulu dah elok-elok buat GST, kita dah biasa dengan benda tu, tiba-tiba dimasukkan pula. Kenapa boleh berlakunya pelaksanaan cukai tu, tiba-tiba dimasukkan cukai tu? Sekarang nak ada balik. Kenapa berlakunya perkara itu?
I think semasa tu ada combination of both political and also public dissatisfaction. Because politically, GST became like a talking point, I think, for politicians to pinpoint like the weaknesses in the government. And also based on that, the people on the ground were also feeling much more higher prices. So both of that combination of that led to the pemansuhan of the GST earlier. But then I think if they were to reintroduce it again, then they need to find a way to circumvent all of these things that happen by, I think, better transparency. There also needs to be more awareness with the people on what kind of data is available, so that they can also monitor prices. Then they can also anticipate how to change their expenditure and things like that. So there has to be some steps that needs to be taken in order that when they do implement GST in the future, it will be a much more smoother transition compared to the last time when you have Ministry of Domestic Trade. They have to very closely monitor prices to make sure that businesses are not taking advantage of the consumer. So they have to, this is why I think again I would mention that data is very important, because the government needs to utilize all the data that is available to ensure that they are able to monitor prices very closely and also react very quickly. When the prices are increased, then they're able to react and then intervene and then put in some policies to intervene. Yeah.
Pada pendapat Cik Sharmila lah, adakah GST ni sesuatu yang terpaksa diperkenalkan oleh negara demi menjaga kestabilan ekonomi negara? Orang kata nak tak nak kena juga, terpaksa kita buat untuk menstabilkan ekonomi negara.
I wouldn't say terpaksa, tapi I think every country has to have a good tax system, and then also our tax reform it's been the government revenue has been going down for many years. So there has to be some kind of action taken by the government in order to increase our government revenue. Otherwise, we won't be able to increase investment or to make Malaysia more competitive for investments and trade. There has to be some kind of tax reform, be it if it's GST ataupun there's some way that they can increase the current SST to modify it to make it much more better, that to prevent leakages dalam the supply chain, so that they will have a better tax reform lah. Tapi it's something that needs to be done.
Semua ahli politik akan menyatakan GST ni dibuat tanpa membebankan rakyat, tetapi realitinya cukai dia tak cukai, rakyat tak kisah pun benda tu bagus untuk ekonomi negara ke apa ke. Orang Malaysia ni dengar je perkataan cukai dah sakit hati, dah mengamuk kan. Jadi benarkah rakyat Malaysia kita ni allergic dengan cukai, ataupun cukai dekat Malaysia ni memang agak merumitkan dan membebankan secara jujurnya lah?
Yeah. I don't think this is like a specific to Malaysia, issue specific to Malaysia. I rasa cukai anywhere, anywhere, every individual will have a problem in paying money because it's coming out of a paycheck. So I think every country, everyone has issues with income tax. But then I think it's up to how Malaysia as the government builds trust with the taxpayers to ensure that the system that we have is the most beneficial for them. So there has to be some kind of trust, there has to be some kind of engagement between the government and also the people. And also when we are talking about taxes, I don't think it's really part of our education system. Students are not really aware about taxes, but in reality taxes are actually a huge part of our adult life. But then most of the time, by the time you come to the working environment, we don't even know what are taxes, and then we have to file for taxes and we don't know what actually the basics are. And a lot of what we earn goes into taxes. So there needs to be a lot more awareness and also in general financial literacy, I guess, in Malaysia.
Okay, Cik Sharmila ada menyebut education tadi. Mungkin ramai yang kurang peka dengan kepentingan cukai ni sebab kurangnya education tentang cukai ni. Jadi mungkinkah pelajaran berkenaan cukai dan penggunaannya harus ditambah masuk ke dalam subjek di sekolah?
I'm sure banyak government agencies and all are also doing some form of awareness on taxes, tapi maybe based on the opposition towards taxes in Malaysia, especially when you introduce something like GST, there needs to be better education lah, I think, and also better education at a much more younger stage, like in schools, is be important, because if you don't have that understanding, when you come into working life, you get busy, you don't have time to explore. Even if government agencies are trying to explain to you what taxes are, maybe you don't have time to explore it because you're working the whole day. So even if you were to introduce it in schools, I think maybe students will have much more space to understand taxes, at least the basics of it.
Cik Sharmila ada tips tak macam mana kita nak mengikhlaskan untuk membayar cukai? Sebab betul, seperti yang disebutkan Cik Sharmila tadi, kita ni susah nak bayar cukai ataupun rasa terbeban ni sebab menggunakan our own money, hasil titik peluh kita.
I think in certain countries macam Australia, bila kita bayar taxes, they also give you your breakdown of mana taxes tu disalurkan. For example, disalurkan untuk healthcare ataupun disalurkan untuk social protection. So they do provide that kind of breakdown. So if I think if the people were able to see that, oh, my money is actually going into healthcare, then then when I go to the government hospital, I'm paying less fees for the government hospital compared to private sector. Then you feel like better that I'm paying taxes for some reason eventually. Of course, a lot of the taxes are also used for the day-to-day of the government, like when baiki jalan raya, things like that. That you see that the government needs some money to run the country. The people are able to visualize that for a country to run well, they need to pay taxes, then they should be able to understand that. But then I think still akan terasa bila but at least bila ada potongan dekat dalam salary pay tu, you can definitely feel it. But then at least you have some understanding, basic understanding that this money is being used for all these things that we're looking at.
Tadi di awal-awal tadi Cik Sharmila dah sebut dah, mana-mana negara pun bila sesuatu cukai ni akan dilaksanakan akan tidak bersetuju. Mana-mana negara pun termasuklah Malaysia. Tapi lama kelamaan akan menyesuaikan diri dengan cukai, dengan GST ni. Jadi adakah dijangka Malaysia pun akan begitu? Over the time rakyat akan heal dan terima hakikat.
Macam India also, when they introduced GST, there was also a lot of opposition. Tapi I think based on, I think that the government also gave this narrative that the reason why we're producing GST is because we need to fund all these things. So bila ada narrative tu and also engagement dengan the public, then the public also be able to understand why they need the GST. And also if corruption is an issue, GST is also very important to help with transparency and also having a very clean tax system. So if there's the trust between the government and the people, I think implementation will be much more easier. But I think it's up to the current government to like build that trust with the people.
Di ujung-ujung ni mungkin Cik Sharmila ada nak katakan sesuatu untuk si tidak pembayar cukai di luar sana. Bukanlah untuk encourage diorang untuk membayar cukai lah. Please pay your taxes straightforward.
And then also like I think for the government, I think there should be better transparency on di mana fiscal expenditure is being done, so that people can see that this is where the expenditure is and how important it is to pay the taxes, so that they can understand. But I think there are people who are not paying the taxes, then they are just not following the rules, then they should pay the taxes. Tu macam technical juga subject dia. So bila government cuba nak explain, maybe tak sampai to the public because it's a bit complicated. Bila kita cakap pasal consumption tax, indirect tax, I think people pun lose interest to understand because it's so technical, right? So I think there should be a way that the government can like reach the target audience to build some kind of awareness about taxes without being, I think, too bogged down dengan the technical. And then also there should be a lot of transparency in how they publish their information.
Kita pun sampai ke penghujung show untuk topik kita hari ini yang berkisarkan tentang kembalinya GST. Terima kasih diucapkan buat Cik Sharmila yang mewakili idea atas kesudian untuk bersama dengan Yaya hari ini. Orang kata kita berkongsi ilmu tentang cukai. Mungkin ramai yang dah tak berminat dengan cukai, tapi inilah realiti yang kita kena hadapi, bayar cukai. So kira itu saja dari Yaya dan TMKR. Kita jumpa lagi di lain hari, lain topik untuk dibahaskan bersama orang muda kampus kita hanya di My Campus Radio. Jom berubah bersama. Bye.